Hello, everyone. I'm Matthew Allen, and welcome back to What a Book. Today we continue on in Stay Out of the Basement. I've got to go get it, Casey said. Otherwise, Dad'll know. It's too late, Margaret interrupted, her eyes on the driveway. He's already pulled up the drive. It'll only take a second, Casey insisted, his hand on the basement doorknob. I'll run down and run right up. No. Margaret stood tensely in the center of the narrow hallway, halfway between the front door and the basement door, her eyes toward the front. He's parked. He's getting out of the car. But he'll know. He'll know, Casey cried, his voice high and whiny. So? Remember how mad he got last time? Casey asked. Of course I remember, Margaret replied. But he's not going to kill us, Casey, just because we took a peek at his plants. He's... Margaret stopped. She moved closer to the screen door. Hey, wait. What's going on? Casey asked. Hurry. Margaret turned and gestured with both hands. Go, get downstairs, fast. Mr. Henry from next door. He stopped Dad. They're talking about something in the drive. With a loud cry, Casey flung open the basement door and disappeared. Margaret heard him clumping rapidly down the stairs. Then she heard his footsteps fade as he hurried into their father's workroom. Hurry, Casey, she thought, standing guard at the front door, watching her father shielding his eyes from the sun with one hand as he talked with Mr. Henry. Hurry. You know Dad never talks for long with the neighbors. Mr. Henry seemed to be doing all the talking, probably asking Dad some kind of favor, Margaret thought. Mr. Henry wasn't handy at all, not like Dr. Brewer, and so he was always asking Margaret's dad to come over and help repair or install things. Her father was nodding now, a tight smile on his face. Hurry, Casey. Get back up here. Where are you? Still shielding his eyes, Dr. Brewer gave Mr. Henry a quick wave. Then both men spun around and began walking quickly toward their houses. Hurry, Casey. Casey, he's coming. Hurry, Margaret urged silently. It doesn't take this long to pick your T-shirt up from the floor and run up the stairs. It shouldn't take this long. Her dad was on the front walk now. He spotted her in the doorway and waved. Margaret returned the wave and looked back through the hallway to the basement door. Casey, where are you? She called aloud. No reply. No sound from the basement. No sound at all. Dr. Brewer had paused outside to inspect the rose bushes at the head of the front walk. Casey? Margaret called. Still no reply. Casey, hurry! Silence. Her father was crouching down, doing something to the soil beneath the rose bushes. With a feeling of dread weighing down her entire body, Margaret realized she had no choice. She had to go downstairs and see what was keeping Casey. Chapter 6. Casey ran down the steps, leaning on the metal banister so that he could jump down 2 steps at a time. He landed hard on the cement basement floor and darted into the bright white light of the plant room. Stopping at the entranceway, he waited for his eyes to adjust to the brighter-than-day light. He took a deep breath, inhaling the steamy air, and held it. It was so hot down here, so sticky. His back began to itch. The back of his neck tingled. The jungle of plants stood as if at attention under the bright white lights. He saw his T-shirt lying crumpled on the floor a few feet from a tall, leafy tree. The tree seemed to lean toward the T-shirt, its long tendrils hanging down, loosely coiled on the soil around its trunk. Casey took a timid step into the room. Why am I so afraid? He wondered. It's just a room filled with strange plants. Why do I have the feeling that they're watching me, waiting for me? He scolded himself for being so afraid and took a few more steps toward the crumpled T-shirt on the floor. Hey. Wait. The breathing. There it was again. Steady breathing. Not too loud, not too soft either. Who could be breathing? What could be breathing? Was the big tree breathing? Casey stared at the shirt on the floor. So near. What was keeping him from grabbing it and running back upstairs? What was holding him back? He took a step forward, then another. Was the breathing growing louder? He jumped, startled by a sudden low moan from the big supply closet against the wall. It sounded so human, as if someone were in there, moaning in pain. Casey, where are you? Margaret's voice sounded so far away, even though she was just at the head of the stairs. Okay so far, he called back to her, but his voice came out in a whisper. She probably couldn't hear him. He took another step. Another. The shirt was about 3 yards away. A quick dash, a quick dive, and he'd have it. Another low moan from the supply closet. A plant seemed to sigh. A tall fern suddenly dipped low, shifting its leaves. Casey! He could hear his sister from upstairs, sounding very worried. Casey, hurry! I'm trying, he thought. I'm trying to hurry. What was holding him back? Another low moan, this time from the other side of the room. He took 2 more steps, then crouched low, his arms straight out in front of him. The shirt was almost within reach. He heard a groaning sound, then more breathing. He raised his eyes to the tall tree. The long, ropey tendrils had tensed, stiffened. Or had he imagined it? No. They had been drooping loosely. Now they were taut. Ready. Ready to grab him? Casey, hurry! Margaret called, sounding even farther away. He didn't answer. He was concentrating on the shirt. Just a few feet away. Just a few feet. Just a foot. The plant groaned again. Casey! Casey! The leaves quivered all the way up to the trunk. Just a foot away. Almost in reach. Casey, are you okay? Answer me! He grabbed the shirt. 2 snake-like tendrils swung out at him. Huh? He cried out, paralyzed with fear. What's happening? The tendrils wrapped themselves around his waist. Let go! He cried, holding the t-shirt tightly in one hand, grabbing at the tendrils with the other. The tendrils hung on and gently tightened around him. Margaret. Casey tried calling, but no sound came out of his mouth. Margaret. He jerked violently, then pulled straight ahead. The tendrils held on. They didn't squeeze him. They weren't trying to strangle him or pull him back, but they didn't let go. They felt warm and wet against his bare skin, like animal arms, not like a plant. Help! He again tried to shout. He pulled once more, leaning forward, using all his strength. No good. He ducked low, hit the floor, tried to roll away. The tendrils hung on. The plant uttered a loud sigh. Let go! Casey cried, finally finding his voice. And then suddenly Margaret was standing beside him. He hadn't heard her come down the stairs. He hadn't seen her enter the room. Casey! She cried. What's... Her mouth dropped open and her eyes grew wide. It won't let go, he told her. No, she screamed, and grabbed one of the tendrils with both hands, and tugged with all her strength. The tendril resisted for only a moment, then went slack. Casey uttered a joyful cry and spun away from the remaining tendril. Margaret dropped the tendril and grabbed Casey's hand and began running toward the stairs. Oh! They both stopped short at the bottom of the stairway. Standing at the top was their father, glaring down at them, his hands balled into tight fists at his sides, his face rigid with anger. Chapter 7. Dad, the plants! Margaret cried. He stared down at them, his eyes cold and angry, unblinking. He was silent. It grabbed Casey, Margaret told him. I just went down to get my shirt, Casey said, his voice trembling. They stared up at him expectantly, waiting for him to move, to unball his fist, to relax his hard expression, to speak. But he glared down at them for the longest time. Finally, he said, You're okay? Yeah, they said in unison, both of them nodding. Margaret realized she was still holding Casey's hand. She let go of it and reached for the banister. I'm very disappointed in you both, Dr. Brewer said in a low, flat voice, cool but not angry. Sorry, Margaret said. We knew we shouldn't. We didn't touch anything, really, Casey exclaimed. Very disappointed, their father repeated. Sorry, Dad. Dr. Brewer motioned for them to come upstairs. Then he stepped into the hallway. I thought he was going to yell at us, Casey whispered to Margaret as he followed her up the steps. That's not Dad's style, Margaret whispered back. He sure yelled at us the last time we stared into the basement, Casey replied. They followed their father into the kitchen. He motioned for them to sit down at the white formica table, then dropped into a chair across from them. His eyes went from one to the other, as if studying them, as if seeing them for the first time. His expression was totally flat, almost robot-like, revealing no emotion at all. "Dad, what's with those plants?" Casey asked. "What do you mean?" Dr. Brewer asked. "They're so weird," Casey said. "I'll explain them to you someday," he said flatly, still staring at the two of them. "It looks very interesting," Margaret said, struggling to say the right thing. Was their dad trying to make them feel uncomfortable? She wondered. If so, he was doing a good job of it. This wasn't like him. Not at all. He was always a very direct person, Margaret thought. If he was angry, he said he was angry. If he was upset, he'd tell them he was upset. So why was he acting so strange, so silent, so cold? "I asked you not to go in the basement," he said quietly, crossing his legs and leaning back so that the kitchen chair tilted back on two legs. "I thought I made it clear." Margaret and Casey glanced at each other. Finally, Margaret said, "We won't do it again." "But can't you take us down there and tell us what you're doing?" Casey asked. He still hadn't put the t-shirt on. He was holding it in a ball between his hands on the kitchen table. "Yeah, we'd really like to understand it," Margaret added enthusiastically. "Someday," their father said. He returned the chair to all four legs and then stood up. "We'll do it soon, okay?" He raised his arms above his head and stretched. "I've got to get back to work." He disappeared into the front hallway. Casey raised his eyes to Margaret and shrugged. Their father reappeared carrying the lab coat he had tossed over the front banister. "Mom got off okay?" Margaret asked. He nodded. "I guess." He pulled on the lab coat over his head. "I hope Aunt Eleanor is okay," Margaret said. Dr. Brewer's reply was muffled as he adjusted the lab coat and straightened the collar. "Later," he said. He disappeared into the hallway. They heard him shut the basement door behind him. "I guess he's not going to ground us or anything for going down there," Margaret said, leaning against the table and resting her chin in her hands. "I guess," Casey said. "He sure is acting weird." "Maybe he's upset because Mom is gone," Margaret said. She sat up and gave Casey a push. "Come on, get up. I've got work to do." "I can't believe that plant grabbed me," Casey said thoughtfully, not budging. "You don't have to push," Casey griped, but he climbed to his feet and stepped out of Margaret's way. "I'm going to have bad dreams tonight," he said glumly. "Just don't think about the basement," Margaret advised. That's really lame advice, she told herself. But what else could she say? She went up to her room, thinking about how she missed her mother already. Then the scene in the basement with Casey trying to pull himself free of the enormous twinning plant tendrils played once again through her mind. With a shudder, she grabbed her textbook and threw herself onto her stomach on the bed, prepared to read. But the words on the page blurred as the moaning, breathing plants kept creeping back into her thoughts. At least we're not being punished for going down there, she thought. At least Dad didn't yell and frighten us this time. And at least Dad has promised to take us downstairs with him soon and explain to us what he's working on down there. That thought made Margaret feel a lot better. She felt better until the next morning when she awoke early and went downstairs to make some breakfast. To her surprise, her father was already at work, the basement door was shut tight, and a lock had been installed on the door. The next Saturday afternoon, Margaret was up in her room, lying on top of the bed, talking to her mom on the phone. "I'm really sorry about Aunt Eleanor," she said, twisting the white phone cord around her wrist. "The surgery didn't go as well as expected," her mother said, sounding very tired. "The doctors say she may have to have more surgery, but they have to build up her strength first." "I guess this means you won't be coming home real soon?" Margaret said sadly. Mrs. Brewer laughed. "Don't tell me you actually miss me." "Well, yes," Margaret admitted. She raised her eyes to the bedroom window. 2 sparrows had landed outside on the window ledge and were chatting excitedly, distracting Margaret, making it hard to hear her mother over the crackling line from Tucson. "How's your father doing?" Mrs. Brewer asked. "I spoke to him last night, but he only grunted." "He doesn't even grunt to us," Margaret complained. She held her hand over her ear to drown out the chattering birds. "He hardly says a word." "He's working really hard," Mrs. Brewer replied. In the background, Margaret could hear some kind of loudspeaker announcement. Her mother was calling from a payphone at the hospital. "He never comes out of the basement," Margaret complained, a little more bitterly than she had intended. "Your father's experiments are very important to him," her mother said. "More important than we are?" Margaret cried. She hated the whiny tone in her voice. She wished she hadn't started complaining about her dad over the phone. Her mother had enough to worry about at the hospital. Margaret knew she shouldn't make her feel even worse. "Your dad has a lot to prove," Mrs. Brewer said, "to himself and to others. I think he's working so hard because he wants to prove to Mr. Martinez and the others at the university that they were wrong to fire him. He wants to show them that they made a big mistake." "But we used to see him more before he was home all the time," Margaret complained. She could hear her mother sigh impatiently. "Margaret, I'm trying to explain to you. You're old enough to understand." "I'm sorry," Margaret said quickly. She decided to change the subject. "He's wearing a baseball cap all of a sudden." "Who? Casey?" No, Mom," Margaret replied. "Dad. He's wearing a Dodgers cap. He never takes it off." "Really?" Mrs. Brewer sounded very surprised. Margaret laughed. "We told him he looks really dorky in it, but he refuses to take it off." Mrs. Brewer laughed too. "Uh-oh, I'm being called," she said. "Gotta run. Take care, dear. I'll try to call back later." A click, and she was gone. Margaret stared up at the ceiling, watching shadows from trees in the front yard move back and forth. The sparrows had flown away, leaving silence behind. Poor Mom, Margaret thought. She's so worried about her sister, and I had to go and complain about Dad. Why did I do that? She sat up, listening to the silence. Casey was over at a friend's. Her dad was no doubt working in the basement, the door carefully locked behind him. Maybe I'll give Diane a call, Margaret thought. She reached for the phone, then realized she was hungry. Lunch first, she decided, then Diane. She brushed her dark hair quickly, shaking her head at the mirror over her dressing table, then hurried downstairs. To her surprise, her dad was in the kitchen. He was huddled over the sink, his back to her. She started to call out to him, but stopped. What was he doing? Curious, she pressed against the wall, gazing at him through the doorway to the kitchen. Dr. Brewer appeared to be eating something. With one hand, he was holding a bag on the counter beside the sink. As Margaret watched in surprise, he dipped his hand into the bag, pulled out a big handful of something, and shoved it into his mouth. Margaret watched him chew hungrily, noisily, then pull out another handful from the bag and eat it greedily. What on earth is he eating? She wondered. He never eats with Casey and me. He always says he isn't hungry, but he sure is hungry now. He acts as if he's starving. She watched from the doorway as Dr. Brewer continued to grab handful after handful from the bag, gulping down his solitary meal. After a while, he crinkled up the bag and tossed it into the trash can under the sink. Then he wiped his hands off on the sides of his white lab coat. Margaret quickly backed away from the door, tiptoed through the hall, and ducked into the living room. She held her breath as her father came into the hall, clearing his throat loudly. The basement door closed behind him. She heard him carefully lock it. When she was sure that he had gone downstairs, Margaret walked eagerly into the kitchen. She had to know what her father had been eating so greedily, so hungrily. She pulled open the sink cabinet, reached into the trash, and pulled out the crinkled-up bag. Then she gasped aloud as her eyes ran over the label. Her father, she saw, had been devouring plant food. Chapter 8. Margaret swallowed hard. Her mouth felt dry as cotton. She suddenly realized she was squeezing the side of the counter so tightly her hand ached. Forcing herself to loosen her grip, she stared down at the half-empty plant food bag, which she had dropped onto the floor. She felt sick. She couldn't get the disgusting picture out of her mind. How could her dad eat mud? He didn't just eat it, she realized. He shoveled it into his mouth and gulped it down. As if he liked it. As if he needed it. Eating the plant food had to be part of his experiments, Margaret told herself. But what kind of experiments? What was he trying to prove with those strange plants he was growing? The stuff inside the bag smelled sour, like fertilizer. Margaret took a deep breath and held it. She suddenly felt sick to her stomach. Staring at the bag, she couldn't help but imagine what the disgusting muck inside must taste like. Oh, she nearly gagged. How could her own father shove this horrid stuff into his mouth? Still holding her breath, she grabbed the nearly empty bag, wadded it up, and tossed it back into the trash. She started to turn away from the counter when a hand grabbed her shoulder. Margaret uttered a sullen cry and spun around. "Casey!" "I'm home," he said, grinning at her. "What's for lunch?" Later, after making him a peanut butter sandwich, she told Casey what she had seen. Casey laughed. "It isn't funny," she said crossly. "Our own dad was eating dirt." Casey laughed again. For some reason, it struck him funny. Margaret punched him hard on the shoulder, so hard that he dropped his sandwich. "Sorry," she said quickly, "but I don't see what you're laughing at. It's sick. There's something wrong with Dad, something really wrong." "Maybe he just had a craving for plant food," Casey cracked, still not taking her seriously. "You know, like you get a craving for those honey-roasted peanuts." "That's different," Margaret snapped. "Eating dirt is disgusting. Why won't you admit it?" But before Casey could reply, Margaret continued, letting all of her unhappiness out at once. "Don't you see? Dad has changed. A lot. Even since Mom has been gone. He spends even more time in the basement." "That's because Mom isn't around," Casey interrupted. "And he's so quiet all the time and so cold to us." Margaret continued, ignoring him. "He hardly says a word to us. He used to kid around all the time and ask us about our homework. He never says a human word. He never calls me princess or fatso the way he used to. He never—" "You hate those names, fatso," Casey said, giggling with a mouthful of peanut butter. "I know," Margaret said impatiently. "That's just an example." "So what are you going to say?" Casey asked. "That Dad is out of his tree? That he's gone totally bananas?" I don't know," Margaret answered in frustration. "Watching him gulp down that disgusting plant food, I had this horrible thought that he's turning into a plant." Casey jumped up, causing his chair to scrape back across the floor. He began staggering around the kitchen, zombie-like, his eyes closed, his arms stretched out stiffly in front of him. "I am the incredible plant man," he declared, trying to make his voice sound bold and deep. "Not funny," Margaret insisted, crossing her arms over her chest, refusing to be amused. "Plant man versus weed woman," Casey declared, staggering toward Margaret. "Not funny," she repeated. He bumped into the counter, banging his knee. "Ow." "Serves you right," Margaret said. "Plant man kills," he cried, and rushed at her. He ran right into her, using his head as a battering ram against her shoulder. "Casey, will you stop it?" she screamed. "Give me a break." Okay, he backed off. "If you'll do me one favor." "What favor?" Margaret asked, rolling her eyes. "Make me another sandwich." Monday afternoon after school, Margaret, Casey, and Diane were tossing a frisbee back and forth in Diane's backyard. It was a warm, breezy day, the sky dotted with small, puffy white clouds. Diane tossed the disc high. It sailed over Casey's head into the row of fragrant lemon trees that stretched from behind the clapboard garage. Casey went running after it and tripped over an in-ground sprinkler that poked up just an inch above the lawn. Both girls laughed. Casey, on the run, flung the frisbee toward Margaret. She reached for it, but the breeze sent it sailing from her hand. "What's it like to have a mad scientist for a dad?" Diane asked suddenly. "What?" Margaret wasn't sure she heard right. "Don't just stand there, throw it," Casey urged from beside the garage. Margaret tossed the frisbee high in the air in her brother's general direction. He liked to run and make diving catches. "Just because he's doing strange experiments doesn't mean he's a mad scientist," Margaret said sharply. "Strange is right," Diane said, her expression turning serious. "I had a nightmare last night about those gross plants in your basement. They were crying and reaching for me." "Sorry," Margaret said sincerely. "I've had nightmares too." "Look out," Casey cried. He tossed a low one that Diane caught around her ankles. Mad scientist, Margaret thought. Mad scientist. Mad scientist. The words kept repeating in her mind. Mad scientists were only in the movies. Right? "My dad was talking about your dad the other night," Diane said, flipping the disc to Casey. "You didn't tell him about going down in the basement, did you?" Margaret asked anxiously. No, Diane replied, shaking her head. Hey, are those lemons ripe? Casey asked, pointing at one of the low trees. Why don't you suck one to find out? Margaret snapped, annoyed that he kept interrupting. Why don't you? He predictably shot back. My dad said that your dad was fired from Polytech because his experiments got out of control and he wouldn't stop them, Diane confided. She ran along the smooth, closely cropped grass, chasing down the frisbee. What do you mean? Margaret asked. The university told him he had to stop whatever it was he was doing, and he refused. He said he couldn't stop. At least that's what my dad heard from a guy who came into the sales room. Margaret hadn't heard this story. It made her feel bad, but she thought it was probably true. Something really bad happened in your dad's lab, Diane continued. Someone got really hurt or killed or something. That's not true, Margaret insisted. We would have heard if that happened. Yeah, probably, Diane admitted. But my dad said your dad was fired because he refused to stop his experiments. Well, that doesn't make him a mad scientist, Margaret said defensively. She suddenly felt she had to stick up for her father. She wasn't sure why. I'm just telling you what I heard, Diane said, brusquely tossing back her red hair. You don't have to bite my head off. They played for a few more minutes. Diane changed the subject and talked about some kids they knew who were 11 but were going steady. Then they talked about school for a while. Time to go, Margaret called to Casey. He picked the frisbee up from the lawn and came running over. Call you later, Margaret told Diane, giving her a little wave. Then she and Casey began to jog home, cutting through familiar backyards. We need a lemon tree, Casey said as they slowed to a walk. They're cool. Oh, yeah, Margaret replied sarcastically. That's just what we need at our house. Another plant. As they stepped through the hedges into their backyard, they were both surprised to see their dad. He was standing at the rose trellis examining clusters of pink roses. Hey, Dad, Casey called. Catch. He tossed the frisbee to his father. Dr. Brewer turned around a little too slowly. The frisbee glanced off his head, knocking the Dodger's cap off. His mouth opened wide in surprise. He raised his hands to cover his head. But it was too late. Margaret and Casey both shrieked in surprise as they saw his head. At first, Margaret thought her father's hair had turned green. But then she clearly saw that it wasn't hair on his scalp. His hair was gone. It had all fallen out. In place of hair, Dr. Brewer had bright green leaves sprouting from his head. Chapter 9. Kids, it's okay, Dr. Brewer called. He bent down quickly, picked up the baseball cap, and replaced it on his head. A crow flew low overhead, cawing loudly. Margaret raised her eyes to follow the bird, but the sight of the hideous leaves sprouting from her father's head wouldn't go away. Her whole head began to itch as she imagined what it must feel like to have leaves uncurling from your scalp. It's okay, really, Dr. Brewer repeated, hurrying over to them. But, Dad, your head, Casey stammered. He suddenly looked very pale. Margaret felt sick. She kept swallowing hard, trying to ride out the waves of nausea. Come here, you two, their father said softly, putting an arm around each of their shoulders. Let's sit down in the shade over there and have a talk. I spoke to your mom on the phone this morning. She told me you're upset about my work. Your head. It's all green, Casey repeated. I know, Dr. Brewer said, smiling. That's why I put on the cap. I didn't want you two to worry. He led them to the shade of the tall hedges that ran along the garage, and they sat down on the grass. I guess you two think your dad has gotten pretty weird, huh? He stared into Margaret's eyes. Feeling uncomfortable, she looked away. Calling frantically, the crow flew over again, heading in the other direction. Margaret, you haven't said a word, her father said, squeezing her hand tenderly between his. What's wrong? What do you want to say to me? Margaret sighed and still avoided her father's glance. Come on, tell us. Why do you have leaves growing out of your head? She asked bluntly. It's a side effect, he told her, continuing to hold her hand. It's only temporary. It'll go away soon, and my hair will grow back. But how did it happen? Casey asked, staring at his father's Dodger's cap. A few green leaves poked out from under the brim. Maybe you two would feel better if I explained what I'm trying to do down in the basement, Dr. Brewer said, shifting his weight and leaning back on his hands. I've been so wrapped up in my experiments, I haven't had much time to talk to you. You haven't had any time, Margaret corrected him. I'm sorry, he said, lowering his eyes. I really am. But this work I'm doing is so exciting and so difficult. Did you discover a new kind of plant? Casey asked, crossing his legs beneath him. No, I'm trying to build a new kind of plant, Dr. Brewer explained. Huh? Casey exclaimed. Have you ever talked about DNA in school? Their father asked. They shook their heads. Well, it's pretty complicated, he continued. Dr. Brewer thought for a moment. Let me try and put it in simple terms, he said, fiddling with the bandage around his hand. Let's say we took a person who had a very high IQ. You know, real brain power. Like me, Casey interrupted. Casey, shut up, Margaret said edgily. A real brain, like Casey, Dr. Brewer said agreeably. And let's say we were able to isolate the molecule or gene or a tiny part of a gene that enabled the person to have such high intelligence. And then let's say we were able to transmit it into other brains. And then this brain power could be passed along from generation to generation. And lots of people would have a high IQ. Do you understand? He looked first at Casey, then at Margaret. Yeah, kind of, Margaret said. You took a good quality from one person and put it into other people. And then they have the good quality too, and they pass it on to their children and on and on. Very good, Dr. Brewer said, smiling for the first time in weeks. That's what a lot of botanists do with plants. They try to take the fruit-bearing building block from one plant and put it into another, create a new plant that will bear 5 times as much fruit, or 5 times as much grain or vegetables. And that's what you're doing? Casey asked. Not exactly, their father said, lowering his voice. I'm doing something a little more unusual. I really don't want to go into detail now. But I'll tell you that what I'm trying to do is build a kind of plant that has never existed and could never exist. I'm trying to build a plant that's part animal. Casey and Margaret stared at their father in surprise. Margaret was the first to speak. You mean you're taking cells from an animal and putting them into a plant? He nodded. I really don't want to say more. You two understand why this must be kept secret. He turned his eyes on Margaret, then Casey, studying their reactions. How do you do it? Margaret asked, thinking hard about everything he had just told them. How do you get these cells from the animals to the plant? I'm trying to do it by breaking them down electronically, he answered. I have 2 glass booths connected by a powerful electron generator. You may have seen them when you were snooping around down there. He made a sour face. Yeah, they look like phone booths, Casey said. One booth is a sender, and one is a receiver, he explained. I'm trying to send the right DNA, the right building blocks, from one booth to the other. It's very delicate work. And have you done it? Margaret asked. I've come very close, Dr. Brewer said, a pleased smile crossing his face. The smile lasted only a few seconds. Then, his expression thoughtful, he abruptly climbed to his feet. Gotta get back to work, he said quietly. See you two later. He started walking across the lawn, taking long strides. But, Dad, Margaret called after him. She and Casey climbed to their feet, too. Your head. The leaves. You didn't explain it, she said as she and her brother hurried to catch up to him. Dr. Brewer shrugged. Nothing to explain, he said curtly. Just a side effect. He adjusted his Dodgers cap. Don't worry about it. It's only temporary. Just a side effect. Then he hurried into the house. Casey seemed really pleased by their dad's explanation of what was going on in the basement. Dad's doing really important work, he said, with unusual seriousness. But as Margaret made her way into the house, she found herself troubled by what her dad had said. and even more troubled by what he hadn't said. Margaret closed the door to her room and lay down on the bed to think about things. Her father hadn't really explained the leaves growing on his head. Just a side effect, didn't explain much at all. A side effect from what? What actually caused it? What made his hair fall out? When will his hair grow back? It was obvious that he hadn't wanted to discuss it with them. He had certainly hurried back to his basement after telling them it was just a side effect. A side effect. It made Margaret feel sick every time she thought about it. What must it feel like? Green leaves pushing up from your pores, uncurling against your head. Yuck. Thinking about it made her itch all over. She knew she'd have hideous dreams tonight. She grabbed her pillow and hugged it over her stomach, wrapping her arms tightly around it. There were lots of other questions Casey and I should have asked, she decided. Like, why were the plants moaning down there? Why did some of them sound like they were breathing? Why did that plant grab Casey? What animal was Dad using? Lots of questions. Not to mention the one Margaret wanted to ask most of all. Why were you gulping down that disgusting plant food? But she couldn't ask that one. She couldn't let her dad know she'd been spying on him. She and Casey hadn't really asked any of the questions they'd wanted answered. They were just so pleased that their father had decided to sit down and talk with them, even for a few minutes. His explanation was really interesting, as far as it went, Margaret decided, and it was good to know that he was close to doing something truly amazing, something that would make him really famous. But what about the rest of it? A frightening thought entered her mind. Could he have been lying to them? No, she quickly decided. No, Dad wouldn't lie to us. There are just some questions he hasn't answered yet. Still, she was still thinking about all of these questions late that night. After dinner, after talking to Diane on the phone for an hour, after homework, after watching a little TV, after going to bed. And she was still puzzling over them. When she heard her father's soft footsteps coming up the carpeted stairs, she sat up in bed. A soft breeze fluttered the curtains across the room. She listened to her father's footsteps pass her room, heard him go into the bathroom, heard the water begin to run into the sink. I've got to ask him, she decided. Glancing at the clock, she saw that it was 2:30 in the morning, but she realized she was wide awake. I've got to ask him about the plant food. Otherwise, it will drive me crazy. I'll think about it and think about it and think about it. Every time I see him, I'll picture him standing over the sink, shoving handful after handful into his mouth. There's got to be a simple explanation, she told herself, climbing out of bed. There's got to be a logical explanation. And I have to know it. She padded softly down the hall, a sliver of light escaping through the bathroom door, which was slightly ajar. Water still ran into the sink. She heard him cough, then heard him adjust the water. I have to know the answer, she thought. I'll just ask him point blank. She stepped into the narrow triangle of light and peered into the bathroom. He was standing at the sink, leaning over it, his chest bare, his shirt tossed behind him on the floor. He had put the baseball cap on the closed toilet lid, and the leaves covering his head shone brightly under the bathroom light. Margaret held her breath. The leaves were so green, so thick. He didn't notice her. He was concentrating on the bandage on his hand. Using a small scissors, he cut the bandage, then peeled it off. The hand was still bleeding, Margaret saw. Or was it? What was that dripping from the cut on her father's hand? Still holding her breath, she watched him wash it off carefully under the hot water. Then he examined it, his eyes narrowed in concentration. After washing, the cut continued to bleed. Margaret stared hard, trying to better focus her eyes. It couldn't be blood, could it? It couldn't be blood dripping into the sink. It was bright green. She gasped and started to run back to her room. The floor creaked under her footsteps. Who's there? Dr. Brewer said. Margaret? Casey? He poked his head into the hallway as Margaret disappeared back into her room. He saw me, she realized, leaping into bed. He saw me, and now he's coming after me. Chapter 10. Margaret pulled the covers up to her chin. She realized she was trembling, her whole body shaking and chilled. She held her breath and listened. She could still hear water splashing into the bathroom sink, but no footsteps. He isn't coming after me, she told herself, letting out a long, silent sigh. How could I have thought that? How could I have been so terrified of my own father? Terrified. It was the first time the word had crossed her mind. But sitting there in bed, trembling so violently, holding onto the covers so hard, listening for his approaching footsteps, Margaret realized she was terrified of her own father. If only Mom were home, she thought. Without thinking, she reached for the phone. She had the idea in her head to call her mother, wake her up, tell her to come home as fast as she could, tell her something terrible was happening to Dad, that he was changing, that he was acting so weird. She glanced at the clock. 2:43. No, she couldn't do that. Her poor mother was having such a terrible time in Tucson trying to care for her sister. Margaret couldn't frighten her like that. Besides, what could she say? How could she explain to her mother how she had become terrified of her own father? Mrs. Brewer would just tell her to calm down, that her father still loved her, that he would never harm her, that he was just caught up in his work. Caught up. He had leaves growing out of his head. He was eating dirt, and his blood was green. Caught up. She heard the water in the sink shut off. She heard the bathroom light being clicked off. Then she heard her father pad slowly to his room at the end of the hall. Margaret relaxed a little, slid down in the bed, loosened her grip on the blankets. She closed her eyes and tried to clear her mind. She tried counting sheep. That never worked. She tried counting to 1,000. At 375, she sat up. Her head throbbed. Her mouth was dry as cotton. She decided to go downstairs and get a drink of cold water from the refrigerator. I'm going to be a wreck tomorrow, she thought, making her way silently through the hall and down the stairs. It is tomorrow. What am I going to do? I've got to get to sleep. The kitchen floor creaked beneath her bare feet. The refrigerator motor clicked on noisily, startling her. Be cool, she told herself. You've got to be cool. She had opened the refrigerator and was reaching for the water bottle when a hand grabbed her shoulder. Ah! She cried out and dropped the open bottle onto the floor. Ice-cold water puddled around her feet. She leapt back, but her feet were soaked. Casey, you scared me, she exclaimed. What are you doing up? What are you doing up? He replied, half asleep, his blonde hair matted against his forehead. I couldn't sleep. Help me mop up this water. I didn't spill it, he said, backing away. You mop it up. You made me spill it, Margaret declared shrilly. She grabbed a roll of paper towels off the counter and handed him a wad of them. Come on, hurry. They both got down on their knees and, by the light from the refrigerator, began mopping up the cold water. I just kept thinking about things, Casey said, tossing a soaking wad of paper towel into the counter. That's why I can't sleep. Me too, Margaret said, frowning. She started to say something else, but a sound from the hallway stopped her. It was a plaintive cry, a moan filled with sadness. Margaret gasped and stopped dabbing at the water. What was that? Casey's eyes filled with fear. They heard it again, such a sad sound, like a plea, a mournful plea. It's coming from the basement, Margaret said. Do you think it's a plant? Casey asked very quietly. Do you think it's one of Dad's plants? Margaret didn't answer. She crouched on her knees, not moving, just listening. Another moan, softer this time, but just as mournful. I don't think Dad told us the truth, she told Casey, staring into his eyes. He looked pale and frightened in the dim refrigerator light. I don't think a tomato plant would make a sound like that. Margaret climbed to her feet, collected the wet clumps of paper towel, and deposited them in the trash can under the sink. Then she closed the refrigerator door, covering the room in darkness. Her hand on Casey's shoulder, she guided him out of the kitchen and through the hall. They stopped at the basement door and listened. Silence now. Casey tried the door. It was locked. Another low moan, sounding very nearby now. It's so human, Casey whispered. Margaret shuddered. What was going on down in the basement? What was really going on? She led the way up the stairs and waited at her doorway until Casey was safely in his room. He gave her a wave, yawning silently, and closed the door behind him. A few seconds later, Margaret was back in her bed, the covers pulled up to her chin despite the warmth of the night. Her mouth was still achingly dry, she realized. She had never managed to get a drink. Somehow, she drifted into a restless sleep. Her alarm went off at 7:30. She sat up and thought about school. Then she remembered there was no school for the next 2 days because of some kind of teachers' conference. She turned off the clock radio, slumped back onto her pillow, and tried to go back to sleep. But she was awake now, thoughts of the night before pouring back into her mind, flooding her with the fear she had felt just a few hours earlier. She stood up and stretched, and decided to go talk to her father, to confront him first thing, to ask all the questions she wanted to ask. If I don't, he'll disappear down to the basement, and I'll sit around thinking these frightening thoughts all day, she told herself. I don't want to be terrified of my own father. I don't. She pulled a light cotton robe over her pajamas, found her slippers in the cluttered closet, and stepped out into the hallway. It was hot and stuffy in the hall, almost suffocating. Pale morning light filtered down from the skylight overhead. She stopped in front of Casey's room, wondering if she should wake him so that he could ask their father questions too. No, she decided. The poor guy was up half the night. I'll let him sleep. Taking a deep breath, she walked the rest of the hall and stopped at her parents' bedroom. The door was open. Dad? No reply. Dad, are you up? She stepped into the room. Dad? He didn't seem to be there. The air in here was heavy and smelled strangely sour. The curtains were drawn. The bedclothes were rumpled and tossed down at the foot of the bed. Margaret took a few more steps toward the bed. Dad? No. She had missed him. He was probably already locked in his basement workroom, she realized unhappily. He must have gotten up very early and... What was that in the bed? Margaret clicked on a dresser lamp and stepped up beside the bed. Oh no, she cried, raising her hands to her face in horror. The bedsheet was covered with a thick layer of dirt. Clumps of dirt. Margaret stared down at it, not breathing, not moving. The dirt was black and appeared to be moist. And the dirt was moving. Moving? It can't be, Margaret thought. That's impossible. She leaned down to take a closer look at the layer of dirt. No, the dirt wasn't moving. The dirt was filled with dozens of moving insects and long brown earthworms, all crawling through the wet, black clumps that lined her father's bed. Chapter 11. Casey didn't come downstairs until 10:30. Before his arrival, Margaret had made herself breakfast, managed to pull on jeans and a t-shirt, had talked to Diane on the phone for half an hour, and had spent the rest of the time pacing back and forth in the living room, trying to decide what to do. Desperate to talk to her dad, she had banged a few times on the basement door, timidly at first and then loudly. But he either couldn't hear her or chose not to. He didn't respond. When Casey finally emerged, she poured him a tall glass of orange juice and led him out to the backyard to talk. It was a hazy day, the sky mostly yellow, the air already stifling hot even though the sun was still hovering low over the hills. Walking toward the block of green shade cast by the hedges, she told her brother about their dad's green blood and about the insect-filled dirt in his bed. Casey stood open-mouthed, holding the glass of orange juice in front of him, untouched. He stared at Margaret and didn't say anything for a very long time. Finally, he set the orange juice down on the lawn and said, "What should we do?" in a voice just above a whisper. Margaret shrugged. "I wish Mom would call." "Would you tell her everything?" Casey asked, shoving his hands deep into the pockets of his baggy shorts. "I guess," Margaret said. "I don't know if she'd believe it, but..." "It's so scary," Casey said. "I mean, he's our dad. We've known him our whole lives. I know," Margaret said. "But he's not the same. Maybe he can explain it all," Casey said thoughtfully. "Maybe there's a good reason for everything, like the leaves on his head." "We asked him about that," Margaret reminded her brother. "He just said it was a side effect. Not much of an explanation." Casey nodded, but didn't reply. "I told some of it to Diane," Margaret admitted. Casey looked up at her in surprise. "Well, I had to tell somebody," she snapped edgily. "Diane thought I should call the police." "Huh?" Casey shook his head. "Dad hasn't done anything wrong." Has he? What would the police do? I know, Margaret replied. That's what I told Diane. But she said there's got to be some kind of law against being a mad scientist. Dad isn't a mad scientist, Casey said angrily. That's stupid. He's just... Just what? Margaret thought. What is he? A few hours later, they were still in the backyard trying to figure out what to do when the kitchen door opened and their father called them to come in. Margaret looked at Casey in surprise. I don't believe it. He came upstairs. Maybe we can talk to him, Casey said. They both raced into the kitchen. Dr. Brewer, his Dodgers cap in place, flashed them a smile as he set 2 soup bowls down on the table. Hi, he said, brightly. Lunchtime? Huh? You made lunch? Casey exclaimed, unable to conceal his astonishment. Dad, we've got to talk, Margaret said seriously. Afraid I don't have much time, he said, avoiding her stare. Sit down. Try this new dish. I want to see if you like it. Margaret and Casey obediently took their places at the table. What is this stuff? Casey cried. The 2 bowls were filled with a green, pulpy substance. It looks like green mashed potatoes, Casey said, making a face. It's something different, Dr. Brewer said, mysteriously, standing over them at the head of the table. Go ahead. Taste it. I'll bet you'll be surprised. Dad, you've never made lunch for us before, Margaret said, trying to keep the suspicion out of her voice. I just wanted you to try this, he said, his smile fading. You're my guinea pigs. We have some things we want to ask you, Margaret said, lifting her spoon but not eating the green mess. Your mother called this morning, their father said. When? Margaret asked eagerly. Just a short while ago. I guess you were outside and didn't hear the phone ring. What did she say? Casey asked, staring down at the bowl in front of him. Aunt Eleanor's doing better. She's been moved out of intensive care. Your mother may be able to come home soon. Great! Margaret and Casey cried in unison. Eat, Dr. Brewer instructed, pointing to the bowls. Aren't you going to have some? Casey asked, rolling his spoon around in his fingers. No, their father replied quickly. I already ate. He leaned with both hands against the tabletop. Margaret saw that his cut hand was freshly bandaged. Dad, last night, she started, but he cut her off. Eat, will you? Try it. But what is it? Casey demanded, whining. It doesn't smell too good. I think you'll like the taste, Dr. Brewer insisted impatiently. It should taste very sweet. He stared at them, urging them to eat the green stuff. Staring into the bowl, at the mysterious substance, Margaret was suddenly frozen with fear. He's too eager for us to eat this, she thought, glancing up at her brother. He's too desperate. He's never made lunch before. Why did he make this? And why won't he tell us what it is? What's going on here? She wondered. And Casey's expression revealed that he was wondering the same thing. Is Dad trying to do something to us? Is this green stuff going to change us or hurt us or make us grow leaves too? What crazy thoughts, Margaret realized. But she also realized that she was terrified of whatever this stuff was he was trying to feed them. What's the matter with you two? Their father cried impatiently. He raised his hand in an eating gesture. Pick up your spoons. Come on, what are you waiting for? Margaret and Casey raised their spoons and dropped them into the soft green substance. But they didn't raise the spoons to their mouths. They couldn't. Eat! Eat! Dr. Brewer screamed, pounding the table with his good hand. What are you waiting for? Eat your lunch. Go ahead. Eat it! He's giving us no choice, Margaret thought. Her hand was trembling as she reluctantly raised the spoon to her mouth. Chapter 12. Go ahead. You'll like it, Dr. Brewer insisted, leaning over the table. Casey watched as Margaret raised the spoon to her lips. The doorbell rang. Who could that be? Dr. Brewer asked, very annoyed at the interruption. I'll be right back, kids. He lumbered out to the front hall. Saved by the Bell, Margaret said, dropping the spoon back into the bowl with a sickening plop. This stuff is disgusting, Casey whispered. It's some kind of plant food or something. Yuck. Quick, Margaret said, jumping up and grabbing the 2 bowls. Help me. They rushed to the sink, pulled out the wastebasket, and scooped the contents of both bowls into the garbage. Then they carried both bowls back to the table and set them down beside their spoons. Let's go see who's at the door, Casey said. They crept into the hall in time to see a man carrying a black briefcase step into the front entranceway and greet their father with a short handshake. The man had a tanned bald head and was wearing large blue-lensed sunglasses. He had a brown mustache and was wearing a navy blue suit with a red and white striped tie. Mr. Martinez, their father exclaimed. What a surprise. That's Dad's old boss from Polytech, Margaret whispered to Casey. I know, Casey replied peevishly. I said weeks ago I'd come check up on how your work is coming along, Martinez said, sniffing the air for some reason. Wellington gave me a lift. My car is in the garage. For a change. Well, I'm not really ready, Dr. Brewer stammered, looking very uncomfortable even from Margaret's vantage point behind him. I wasn't expecting anyone. I mean, I don't think this is a good time. No problem. I'll just have a quick look around, Martinez said, putting a hand on Dr. Brewer's shoulder as if to calm him. I've always been so interested in your work. You know that. And you know that it wasn't my idea to let you go. The board forced me. They gave me no choice. But I'm not giving up on you. I promise you that. Come on. Let's see what kind of progress you're making. Well, Dr. Brewer couldn't hide his displeasure at Mr. Martinez's surprised appearance. He scowled and tried to block the path to the basement steps. At least, it seemed that way to Margaret, who watched silently beside her brother. Mr. Martinez stepped past Dr. Brewer and pulled open the basement door. Hi, guys. Mr. Martinez gave the 2 kids a wave, hoisting his briefcase as if it weighed 2 tons. Their father looked surprised to see them there. Did you kids finish your lunch? Yeah, it was pretty good, Casey lied. The answer seemed to please Dr. Brewer. Adjusting the brim of his Dodgers cap, he followed Mr. Martinez into the basement, carefully closing and locking the door behind him. Maybe he'll give Dad his job back, Casey said, walking back into the kitchen. He pulled open the refrigerator to look for something for lunch. Don't be stupid, Margaret said, reaching over him to pull out a container of egg salad. If Dad really is growing plants that are part animal, he'll be famous. He won't need a job. Yeah, I guess, Casey said thoughtfully. Is that all there is? Just egg salad? I'll make you a sandwich, Margaret offered. I'm not really hungry, Casey replied. That green stuff made me sick. Why do you think he wanted us to eat it? I don't know, Margaret said. She put a hand on Casey's slender shoulder. I'm really scared, Casey. I wish Mom were home. Me too, he said quietly. Margaret put the egg salad back into the refrigerator. She closed the door, then leaned her hot forehead against it. Casey? What? Do you think Dad is telling us the truth? About what? About anything. I don't know, Casey said, shaking his head. Then his expression suddenly changed. There's one way to find out, he said, his eyes lighting up. Huh? What do you mean? Margaret pushed himself away from the refrigerator. The first chance we get, the first time Dad is away, Casey whispered. Let's go back down in the basement and see for ourselves what Dad is doing. And that is where we will leave off for today. So thank you all so much for joining me for this What a Book. If you liked it, make sure to check out everything that is backlogged here on YouTube, as well as the other things down in the Linktree link in the description. You can catch me over on the Soloist YouTube channel. That's where all of my old gaming videos, as well as all of my VODs from Twitch end up. You can check me out on Twitch at the_soloist_2014, as well as on Twitter. I don't know the handle in my head. It'll be down there. It's in the description. But thank you guys so much again. I've been Matthew Allen. This has been What a Book. And I will see all of you next week.